Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of our BensonLive webinar series, where we're going to be looking at the process and complexity of sourcing grapes to make wines. My name, of course, is Taya Schlendorf with Benson. I'm going to be the moderator for today's discussion. And just before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. It'd be great if you can keep yourselves muted. But please raise a hand or drop a question into the chat function as we go along. At any point, we'll work those in and get those answered. This, of course, is being recorded, so we will be sharing the link out once it's finalized and edited for viewing in the future. You hopefully have received the wines in question, and you're welcome to taste those as we go along, or of course, enjoy them later on in a different context on your own time. And we've got a Dropbox file of information and assets that we've compiled and have shared out, but we'll also reshare and add some things to later on as well. So today's discussion, of course, centers on sourcing, which is not something I think we talk about with consumers all that much. Consumers in particular, many of them, most of them, I think, have this conception of wines coming from a situation where there is a vineyard, a winery, and a tasting room all sort of in the same space and owned by the same entity. And it's a little bit of a romantic notion, but we obviously don't do much to disabuse that thought, because it is a lovely romantic concept of where wines come from. But the reality is that it's very difficult for any one entity to necessarily own all of those pieces, and more to the point, in the scale that they might need them to be at to really run their business in the way that they need it to be done and to be profitable. So today we are going to talk a bit about sourcing. We've got three panelists here who are utilizing it in different ways for their brands, and they're going to tell us a bit more about that. And so let's get into introducing them and who they are and how our discussion is going to go today. So first, I want to introduce Biltmore Winery. Biltmore, of course, is located in Asheville, North Carolina. Many of their wines bear the American appellation, though, as that allows them to have a larger program than what their estate vineyards in Asheville could necessarily supply. Sort of legacy of sourcing the best wines, really the best things, extends all the way back to founder George Vanderbilt, who was always known for having a great varied selection for his guests. He worked with an importer at the time, but he was always looking to bring the best back to the estate. And so today, the Biltmore Winery plays an important part in the business of Biltmore, extending the legendary hospitality that George was known for beyond the grounds in question. So speaking on behalf of Biltmore Winery today is Sharon Fenchak, who is the Vice President and winemaker. And the wine in question that we're going to talk a little bit about today as sort of an example of the sourcing program is the Biltmore Estate Sauvignon Blanc. And so at this point, I want to turn it over to Sharon to introduce herself and Biltmore and this wine. So Sharon, take it away.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for being here today. And thanks, Thea, for the nice introduction to Biltmore. I have actually been with Biltmore since 1999. And at Biltmore, we started sourcing grapes from Mexico and other areas in the United States since the start of the winery in 1985. So it's been something that we've been doing for a very long period of time. And as time has progressed and gone on, we've had to source more and more fruit from the West Coast to bring that fruit back to North Carolina. So it's just part of our normal standing operating procedures. And so we're familiar with it, and we are very thankful to have the opportunity to bring West Coast fruit here to our customers in North Carolina and all throughout the Southeast and even the whole entire United States. So Thea, you want me to introduce the wine now?
Yeah, go for that.
Okay. So the wine that we're actually tasting, or that you have to taste, is our Sauvignon Blanc. And so this is actually, if you have the bottle, as was mentioned earlier, it says American Appellation. So what that means is, of course, the grapes came from America, right? And so we source fruit from all different areas in California and Washington, mostly in California. So for instance, this particular wine, we have some fruit from Lake County, from Mendocino, from Alexander Valley, from the Russian River, and also around Monterey, the Arioseco area. So we get all of these different sources from these different places, and we bring it back to North Carolina, we blend it, and we bottle it. So it really allows a winemaker to have the flexibility to make a consistent blend with all of these different areas and regions coming together. So I feel fortunate that we have the opportunity, say for instance, Mendocino's not a super great year. Well, maybe Lake County is, or maybe Alexander Valley is. And so we can add more of that particular Sauvignon Blanc into our American Appellated Biltmore Estate blend. So, you know, in addition to that, I'm not afraid to add in other varieties to Sauvignon Blanc if it needs just something. So I think of it as like the West Coast area as like a big recipe box of all these different spices and aromas from all these different areas that you can kind of add in to your wine to bring out certain things that it might be missing. So we have a little Viognier in the Sauvignon Blanc and also some Chardonnay. So it's just a lot of fun to kind of play with all of these different areas and regions to make up the best blend.
That's great. Thank you, Sharon. Moving along, I want to introduce Kip Lorenzetti of Chronic Cellars, and let's take a minute to talk about who Chronic is. Located in Paso Robles, their stated aim is to sort of buck the norm of traditional wine culture, and having such a broad base of growers and varieties within the appellation of Paso Robles really helps them to do that and demonstrate that all of the appellation has to offer. So today we have Kip, of course, who's the winemaker for Chronic, and the wine you would have as emblematic of their program is the Chronic Cellars Sofa King Bueno. So Kip, will you give us a little overview of yourself and Chronic and this wine and how it's sort of emblematic of your program?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so my name's Kip Lorenzetti. I've been with Chronic since 2020, taking the reins from the founding winemaker, Josh Beckett. Really with Chronic, the idea is that, the labels are fun, they're whimsical, but, we really take the winemaking seriously and really try to showcase all the things that Paso can do. And the wine that we're going to be showcasing is our, you can see that's in the background, our Sofa King Bueno SKU. This is the original flagship wine when Chronic was founded in 2004. It is a blend of Syrah, Petite Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvedre. And really it comes from, Paso is a really diverse sourcing region. There's 11 different sub-AVAs, and we source from all but 2 of them. So for Sofa, this has it doesn't quite have all the ones we source from. There's 2 that aren't in there, but there's 4 different sub-AVAs in there and 6 different vineyards within those sub-AVAs. So really it's, in each year the blend is a little bit different. The bulk of our program are red blends. So each year is, from a winemaker perspective, we're trying to paint the similar picture, but with slightly different variation and slightly different colors. So it's a really unique blend, and really gives us the opportunity to really showcase, highlight the area.
Thank you. And then moving along, we are just moving slightly over to the Edna Valley with Baleana Winery and Rob Takagawa. And of course, Baleana has been championing the Central Coast since the 1970s with a focus on the cool climate wines that can be grown there. The Niven family really helped to establish the iconic Paragon Vineyard in Edna Valley and the Fire Peak parcel within that. which provided fruit for their wines. But today, under ownership by WX Brands, and we should note that Chronic Cellars is also under the WX umbrellas, Baliana has the ability to tap into even more of what the Edna Valley AVA has to offer. And the Fire Peak Pinot Noir is a good example of that. So I want to have Rob take it away and tell us a bit more about Baliana, of course, yourself, and how the Fire Peak Pinot Noir is sort of emblematic of Baliana and the Edna Valley.
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us and giving us the opportunity to speak to you about this subject. Yeah, so I joined with the Nivens in 1999. That was my first harvest with the family. As mentioned before, the Nivens had established Paragon Vineyards in the 70s in the Edna Valley. And it wasn't until 2020 when WX had acquired our brand that I was granted permission to venture outside of our own Paragon Vineyards to source fruit for the different SKUs that we have, but specifically for our Fire Peak, Baliana Fire Peak Pinot Noir. And we just had a new label redesign, there we go, for our Fire Peak Pinot Noir. But yeah, like I mentioned earlier, that the Nivens had established the vineyards in Paragon, at the Paragon Vineyard, which is in Edna Valley. And one of the things that is that needs to be noted is that the Edna Valley is one of the coolest AVAs in California. So we have what we attribute to a really nice long growing season and some really nice acidity and some really nice ripeness coupled with it at the same time. And so that is the one thing that we can always hang our hat on, especially for the Baliana Fire Peak Pinot Noir and our other aromatic whites as well too. But it's that nice acidity, some nice, and also coupled with some nice ripe flavors. We were obviously able to achieve that in our own Paragon Vineyard, but when WX came along and asked if I can go out and try to source some fruit, I didn't stray from the Edna Valley. I stayed within the AVA, with the exception of Spanish Springs, which actually sits right outside the AVA. On Price Canyon Road, so it's a little bit closer to Pismo Beach than Paragon Vineyard is. But the common denominator with all these vineyards is the nice acidity with long growing season, great phenolic ripeness, and some great ripe flavors as well too. But in the Edna Valley, you still have all these little microclimates, and so that's what I really wanted to capture. I wanted to see how we could change the wine, not necessarily the backbone, which is the acidity and the phenolic ripeness, but what other layers can we can add to this Pinot Noir? And by doing that, I was able to go out to look at the different vineyards. We are in the process of changing some of our D2C Pinot Noirs to the Slow Coast AVA, which would include one of the vineyards, which is Spanish Springs, which sits right outside of the Edna Valley AVA. So the whole intention of going out and sourcing outside of our home vineyard was to be able to add some more layers to what's already the Edna Valley Pinot Noir.
Thank you. So now I am going to get each of our winemakers spotlighted here so that we can move into a bit of a discussion about sourcing. And hopefully we've got this all pulled up correctly here. So our first question to put to the group to kick off this discussion is to delve a little bit more into how does bringing in grapes from outside of your, if you have some respective specific holding areas to help enhance the portfolio or the brand. And I think I'll put this to Sharon first. I know you touched on this a bit, but maybe you can go a little bit more into some of the history that Biltmore has with this process and how it's really helped to grow your portfolio over the years.
Yeah, we had to look for other sources for grapes because we're located in North Carolina. And when Biltmore started, there weren't a lot of grapes in North Carolina to even purchase. So that was one of the main drivers in looking into other areas. We wanted to have a winery in North Carolina So of course we needed grapes, right? So we had to look into different areas. And over time, you know, there's a lot more wineries and vineyards in North Carolina that have come into existence since 1999, but still they're relatively small. So we do purchase from local vineyards in North Carolina and recently in Virginia, but we still need to have more fruit than what's available. And so that's one of the reasons why we source from these other areas. Typically, when we're bringing back grapes or juice or wine from California, it's in about 20-ton reefer trucks or 35 ton equivalent in a tanker. So right around 5,600 gallons, 52 to 5,600 gallons at a time, or in 20-ton truckloads. So a lot of the smaller vineyards, you know, they may have 10 tons, 5 tons, you know, these smaller quantities, but we need, for what we produce a year, we're bottling around 2 million bottles a year. So, you know, we need some additional fruit. And some of the varietals just don't grow well in North Carolina. For instance, Pinot Noir in North Carolina is not a great idea. We have a lot of humidity and, you know, these storms, tropical storms that come up off of the Gulf Coast. Pinot Noir does not like a lot of rain or humidity. So we had a little Pinot Noir planted at Biltmore when I started in '99, and it came up pretty quickly. So we just have to, in North Carolina, we do have a vineyard, a Biltmore Estate vineyard with about 50 acres. And so we have Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and then recently we've planted some Petit Mansang. So we've learned our lessons through the years on what to plant, something that's thin-skinned, loose cluster, and something that can withstand a little bit of humidity and rain. So it's very interesting to grow grapes in North Carolina, and in a good year it can be fantastic, but in a bad year it can be not as fantastic. So I love the opportunity to be able to purchase at other places that have better weather and growing conditions for certain varietals.
And Sharon, we've got a question. Of course, obviously the weather is the foremost predictor of when things need to be picked, but given the fact that you're shipping from California, does that also play a role in any way in terms of the timing of things, in terms of the timing of picking?
It does. If fruit, say for instance, you know, if the West Coast has fruit that's not absolutely perfect, I wouldn't ship that back. I would have it made or processed in California and then ship back later as wine. So we do ship back a lot of wine as well. So, you know, it just depends on the certain grape, you know, the wine, the juice in question at the time. We have a few consultant winemakers that I work with on the West Coast as well. So I rely on them to kind of be my eyes and ears during harvest time, and nose, I guess, and taste buds, all of the above, transported to the West Coast. And really, you know, have a lot of trust with what they're telling, that they're providing, so that, you know, we don't have a lot of surprises. But you're right, with transportation and trucking and supply chain issues over the past 2 years, especially, it's been a little bit more challenging to get things lined up in an ideal scenario for shipping fruit, juice, or wine back.
Yeah, I can imagine. Sticking with the initial sort of question, I'm going to swing around to Kip. Of course, you talked, I love the description that you used in terms of painting, how the sourcing allows you to paint different pictures. And perhaps you'll tell us a little bit more about how it's also allowed you to develop some of the wines in the portfolio alongside the sofa, some of the different opportunities you've been presented with that allowed for that.
Yeah, you know, as I mentioned, the lion's share of Chronics programs are red blends. So because they're blends, those blend percentages aren't fixed every year, so it's baked into the wine's profile that they're going to change, and therefore the flavor profile is going to change slightly every year, which allows, from a sourcing standpoint, it allows you to try different vineyards out, especially within the Paso Robles AVA. Climate-wise and soil type-wise, we're very, very diverse. So, two vineyards right next to each other on the same side of the street might not taste the same. So from an artisan standpoint, from a painter standpoint, there's always the excitement of trying a new vineyard and wondering how that's going to taste and how that's going to bring, what that's going to bring to the blend. Sharon used a great line, which we've all, as winemakers, we've used before, which is spice rack, or spices in the wine. So it's always nice to have different spices in the spice rack, and different vineyards supply those different spices, whether it's, as I mentioned, soil type or aspect or varietal for that sub AVA, or, if it happens to be in a microclimate that really changes the dynamic of what that varietal can express, and how you can take those profiles and work them into the blend and bring something slightly different year in and year out, which really allows the wines to evolve. And the other side of that is sometimes that doesn't work. It's the trying new vineyards, and we've all been there, myself, Rob, and Sharon, have all been there, where everything checked out on paper, then we bring the fruit in, it just didn't show the way we wanted it to. So, and that's part of the excitement, is there's always that uncertainty that comes with trying something new, whether that's a vineyard, and how working it into a blend. The other flexibility it allows too is from a purely functional standpoint, where if you have a vineyard that doesn't perform or has some sort of, I don't want to say disaster, but some sort of event that does not allow for, either decreases the yield or affects quality. For example, I had a vineyard this past May. We got hit with an unseasonable frost in Paso, where I had the grower call me and say, "Hey, you're not getting anything." After a lengthy discussion, he had just gotten decimated by frost. So I had to go try and find another vineyard to bring fruit in, which acts both as a stopgap in the supply, to make sure that we have enough fruit to put these wines out to the market. But at the same time, it also brings that element of, hey, I'm trying something new from a different site, and what could this bring to the table that I didn't have last year that can make these wines better than they were the year before.
On that note, questions come in asking if, in general, are you aiming for a consistent profile of each SKU from vintage to vintage, or are you kind of reveling in this opportunity to maybe express more vintage variation, even in a blend?
Yes and no. It's kind of an umbrella approach. From a winemaker perspective, I mentioned before, for Chronic, the umbrella perspective, the umbrella principle is we're trying to showcase what Paso can do as a region via each little different diverse area, and what those come together, or what those bring to a blend, making sure that that's better than the sum of its parts. That being said, each program has its own specific kind of flavor profile. So Sofa King Bueno is always typically been Syrah, Petit Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvedre. There's been times where there's Graciano in there. There's been times when there's Tannat or Tempranillo in there. But it's always a big, bold red that is full-bodied, structured tannins, nice, dusty, chalky mouthfeel. And it's each vintage, I'm going into that with that principle in mind. Then narrowing it down, it's picking lots and vineyards and sourcing opportunities that could help provide diversity or provide nuance that were different than the year before, under those principles of I made the joke, I'm not going to go turn Sofa into a light-bodied red, because that's not what the wine has always been. But that doesn't mean that maybe this coming year I picked 2 new Grenache vineyards that we didn't have the year before, which may be more of a high-toned fruit than it has been in the past, which can add some high notes while at the same time maintaining a lot of structure. So that goes for the rest of the blends in our portfolio. It's always about maintaining a broad, a kind of umbrella profile, but working within those guardrails to create something, to create nuance and diversity and improvement year over year.
Yeah, thanks. And that's actually a great segue to kick it back to Rob. I know you talked a little bit about how the Bailliana Fire Peak Pinot Noir has benefited from being able to source from a couple different little areas, the excitement that brings to it. Maybe you can speak a bit more to that, and if there are any other wines from Beliana that have similarly benefited.
Oh yeah, Kip just kind of nailed it on the head. It's that, we always have a specific style for each of our different SKUs. We have a lot of D2C wines, so that gives us a lot of flexibility as far as what we want to do creativity with our creativity. Sorry, excuse me. But with the Fire Peak Pinot Noir, we do have those same guardrails that Kip was talking about, and it's important for us to kind of stay within those guardrails. However, bringing online these different sources, these different areas of the valley, we talked about just adding a little more layers and layers to the wine, and just make it just a little bit more different and in a positive way. And by going out and get the fruit from these different sources is exactly how we need to achieve that. Not only that, though, is that a lot of these vineyards as well too, they're fairly new. So the age of the vines, as they get older, those vines and that fruit coming off these vines from these other vineyards outside of the old Paragon vineyard, it's just going to get better and better. So not only are we adding those different layers, adding that different spices, or painting a different picture, every year it's just going to have an improvement or a difference than it had done in the past. Obviously, working within those guardrails. Another thing that's worth mentioning too is that the fruit that I have been sourcing from outside of the Paragon is still the same growers that had been growing and farming the Paragon vineyard for the Nivens since the 70s, and so they know the valley better than anyone else, in the whole area. And those are the growers that I have been working with since 1999 until now, but not only in the old Paragon vineyard, but also in the other vineyards as well too. So they have a good understanding as far as what those guardrails are for us, as far as, we're talking about the Beliana Fire Peak Pinot Noir. They understand exactly where we need to be at the small level, and really it works on what we talked about, the long growing season, producing some nice acidities, the brighter fruits, also with some phenolic ripeness and some ripeness, but also what can this vineyard can contribute to that. And we're both facing in the right direction. So that part of the relationship I have with the grower is the same relationship that we've had since 1999. It's actually the same relationship that started back in the 70s when the Nivens first planted in the Edna Valley. And so it's exactly right. It's just you have these borders that you need to kind of stay within, but once you're in those borders, it's open game. It's whatever you can find, whatever you think is going to make that wine just a little bit more exciting. My old boss, every year, at the end of harvest, he would taste the wines and he would declare it's the best vintage ever, but I think what he's really saying is that, this is nice. We're changing it up just enough to where we can feel very secure and very happy of what we had done, even though it might be just a little bit of tweak here, a little bit of tweak there. It went in the right direction. And I think that's what you really meant. Of course, we always want to say, every harvest is the best one we've got, but we got to be kind of honest for ourselves. But there's those little tweaks within those borders, within those guardrails that Kip had mentioned.
Yeah, thanks. And that's actually a great segue to the next question. We've been talking about these sources. So I'd love to find out more about how you have, as Rob, as you were just talking about, how you have found the growing partners that you are working with. In Beliana's case, a very long history of relationship there. And also, looking ahead, how do you decide which growers to work with for the future? So maybe I have Kip start us off on that one and talk a little bit about some of the sourcing or the relationships that you have for all of the sourcing that you're doing.
Yeah, when I'm approaching a new source or a new vineyard, the three things I always look at are site, fruit, and grower. The make sure the site's good, the varietal, obviously you're gonna something that I can utilize, and the grower. And really the farming techniques you can alter to a certain extent. The site is what the site is. So that's in my case, that's generally what I look at when I'm driving into vineyards. First thing I look at is site and soil type, for what I can tell, aspect. Then the farming practices are the next thing, and those are intricately woven with the grower. depending on the program you're sourcing for too, there's different types of farming as all three of us, on all three of us winemakers here have seen. But really the relationship with the grower is key. If the relationship isn't there or it isn't working out, I mean, it's just like dating or any sort of other relationship. Like sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes it goes out in spectacular fashion. But for example, this past vintage, I sourced some Cabernet Sauvignon, which the site was incredible. The farming was on point, but the relationship with the grower just wasn't there. So, that we chose not to pursue not to have a longer relationship just because it just wasn't working out. So all three of those things for me personally, and I have to line up in order to forge a relationship that you can build on and grow. Because as Rob mentioned, Rob's been with growers for a long time, and as we've all been, once finding a new vineyard is exciting, but at the same time it's nerve-wracking, and it's a lot of work to start that relationship. And if you're doing it constantly, it takes away from a lot of other stuff. So you want to forge these bonds that are long-lasting and healthy, and combining where you're getting good fruit. So when I approach a vineyard, I'm going in for, as long as the vineyard will last, and that can be sometimes 8 to 10 years, or at the minimum you're talking about 2 or 3, at least 2 or 3, average around 5 or 6 before it's to make sure that, and depends on how the vineyard is too. Vineyards are living things, so they're not static relationships where you walk into a vineyard and it's going to be that same vineyard that's going to produce the same quality of fruit year in and year out. Ideally, that's the case. We'd all hope for that. God, it would be so nice if that were the case. But as vineyards age, vines have a shelf life. It's a lot longer than a lot of other crops, but they have a shelf life. So there comes a time when you have to move on from the vineyard, or it becomes redeveloped. I had one vineyard this past year where grower who the site was excellent, the fruit was quality, and had a great relationship with the vineyard manager. The vineyard manager called me immediately after harvest, and the message was, "Hey, I want to talk about fruit." And I went in under the impression that, we just want to make sure he wanted to touch base and see if I needed the same amount of fruit next year and see how the fruit was. And picks up the phone, like, "Hey, Jimmy, how's it going?" It's like, "Hey, that fruit you got this year was Tempranillo and Graciano for our DTC programs." It's like, "Oh, that Tempranillo and Graciano." I'm like, "Yeah, it came out great. And it's a dry farmed vineyard, meaning there's no irrigation." So we had a couple unseasonable heat spikes where typically the practice for combating those heat spikes with an irrigated vineyard is you apply water. The vines take up the water and it helps protect them from the fruit or from the sun. The dry farmed, you kind of get what you get. So if you have a heat spike, it's up to the vine to defend themselves, and sometimes they don't do so well. But the grower's like, "How'd it go?" I'm like, "Oh, the Graciano was a little heat, got hit by the heat, but the Tempranillo was great. I'm really happy with it. Looking forward to next year." He goes, yeah, we tore that out." Or like, "Oh, when did you do that?" He's like, "Oh, we did it yesterday. You're not going to get that fruit anymore." And they had those vines for that particular grower had reached their useful life. So that prompted another sourcing change. And it wasn't anything that had to do with the relationship. It wasn't anything to do with the quality of fruit on my end. But with the vineyard manager, they felt that managing those particular vines at the time wasn't worth it for them anymore, so they tore them out. So those types of changes, those are inevitable. So it's about, but having all three of those, back to my original principle, having all three of those things together is what I look for when I go into a vineyard.
Yeah, certainly a lot of variables to keep track of. And Sharon, you're no stranger to that either. Especially because you are looking at sourcing from quite a broad sort of field on the West Coast there.
Yes, definitely. And I agree with just about everything that Kip talked about as well. So sometimes there's challenges. Obviously, the drought, weather, fires these past few years have been a challenge for a lot of growers. And having to be able to look for other vineyards because, a grower has to make a living on growing grapes. So if years are poor, then, the yields are down, the money they receive is down. and they may change course or decide to get out of the business. So I've seen that a little bit the past 2 years, and so that's been interesting to have these long relationships, 10, 20-year relationship with people very well and trust, and then having to form new relationships with people and the vineyard and the grape itself. So that's been a little challenging the past 2 years. So the biggest thing for me is I have to trust the grower and believe that they're going to tell me what's going on, and trust the consultant winemakers that I work with. And I go out to California periodically myself to check on things, but being on the East Coast, I'm not there every day to look. So the biggest thing is I have to have a really good feeling about the relationship, knowing that I'm going to be able to ask them what's going on, and they're going to be honest with me and tell me what's going on. I liked the comparison to dating, same thing, like if you don't get a good feeling about somebody, you should probably step out quick instead of, riding it out and see what happens. So those red flags, I think, are important with any business relationship or any other relationship in general. So the other thing that Kip didn't really mention that is important for me is I work with different brokers also. So, if you have a good relationship with a broker, they might tell you, hey, I have this awesome fruit. Do you want this awesome fruit? And I might be like, yeah, heck yeah, I want that fruit. So, the relationship with the brokers, the growers, it's just really important. The trust part of it is essential. And before I ever normally work with a vineyard, I'll ask them to send me samples of something that they made from that vineyard, if it's possible, so that I can actually taste it and see if it's in line with what I'm looking for a certain varietal. And if it is, and if the chemistry looks good, I'll ask for the numbers the past 2 to 3 harvests if they have it available, just to see if it's within line with what I'm trying to do with the other grapes that it might be blended with. And if it's a single varietal, and sometimes we'll just work with one particular vineyard and make a wine, say for instance, our limited release series, or our wine that's bottled in California, that's even more important, because you don't have the opportunity for the blending and the adding of the different spice or aromas and flavors that you might get from using different areas and appellations. Did I answer your question, Thea?
Yes.
I kind of went off there in another way. So just.
No, that's okay. This is, the next question that we had talked about a little bit is pretty similar. I mean, we're talking about the strength of these relationships and some of the, how important it is. And many times you've each shared stories about how it's given you a unique opportunity that perhaps wouldn't have presented itself if the relationship wasn't as strong as it was. Kip, for example, you talked about, I believe it was a Syrah vineyard that suddenly became available because of the strength of your relationships there.
Yeah, and forging, and even the wine industry in and of itself is very, very small. It may seem like it is a global industry, but the longer you stay in it, the smaller it becomes, just like any other kind of niche industry. So the relationship that you forge along the way will help open doors in that respect. There's this just recently, a few months ago, had an opportunity where I was talking with a local broker who I've known for many, many years, who has a relationship with another producer who I've known for many, many years, where they had Syrah available, and they were taking in and selling it off as bulk wine, selling as bulk wine. And I floated the question, hey, would you ever sell that as fruit? And then that started the conversation, was able to secure that. And that happens a lot too with, especially in the current market, we've seen here in Paso, Cabernet Sauvignon prices go up precipitously. And I had a contract expiring with the grower who I'd had a very positive relationship with. And I was able to get first crack at the fruit. He had taken a price increase and it didn't really work for us on an economics level, but I was given first right of refusal because I'd been there and we had a positive dynamic. So those types of relationships or give you those little ins, or you're the one who's getting the phone call when a contract expires in this vineyard across the way. You're the one who gets the call first. So those things are paramount to being successful at finding new sources and maintaining other sources you have.
And I'm going to work in a question here that we have. So both you and Rob are geographically pretty close together at the moment, largely working with entirely different varieties. But I think there's one area where you may overlap a little bit, because Rob, you are also making wines for the True Myth brand, specifically a Cabernet. So Cabernet Sauvignon is one variety that you both work with. And does being well, at this point now under the same sort of parent company umbrella, has there ever been any facilities with that between the two of you and working with that same variety, being able to sort of give each other the heads up on some sort of source?
Yeah, I mean, it's since WX had acquired our brands. I mean, WX had Chronic for a while, and then they brought in our brands, which included True Myth Cabernet Sauvignon. It was great having Kip around. I mean, he also has his finger on the pulse of Paso Robles Cab, and so my experience has always been cool climate varietals, and then you go north of the Great and it's completely different. And so yeah, we definitely share the same experiences as far as Cabernet Sauvignon, but to be completely honest, I kind of lean on him quite a bit to help me navigate through Paso. I mean, Paso is so diverse. I mean, it's a pretty big AVA, and there's just so many different little areas that that we can use for our True Myth brands, whether it falls within the costing. If it works out great, then it works out great, but then there's times where I just don't know. And so having Kip there to like I said, help me navigate through Paso Robles has definitely been helpful. And and so we also share the same sources, and so we have the same growers, and we share a lot of the same blocks within those vineyards as well too. And so it's been very helpful to have someone there to help me get through all this. but yeah, we do share quite a bit. In fact, we're having conversations right now with some of the growers for our cab programs.
Yeah, I mean, there was actually just flashing back to when Rob and I ran into a rattlesnake in the same vineyard we shared last year. Fun. We share those blocks, and as well towards the end, because we have the benefit of being under the same parent company, we can horse trade with lots, where if Rob or I bring in certain cabs that like work for the opposite profile, like we can horse trade and work through certain stuff, work through different lots, like, hey, this works better for the Chronic Surreal program, or this works better for True Myth. Hey, despite the fact that one of us made it, we can swap. And as well as during harvest, I mean, if one of us gets stuck somewhere where we can't get out and check a vineyard, it's the Rob's always there for a phone call, like, hey, I can't get to such and such place, can you take a pass through and just let me know what you think, and vice versa. So having that working partner there to be able to keep a pulse on what's happening in those areas where we overlap is really great.
And switching gears a little bit, you've each mentioned to one degree or another an aspect of pressures from climate change. And so the question would be if that is at all affecting some of your sourcing decisions, and how, or if you see it maybe playing a bigger role in the future. And why don't I guess maybe let's start with Rob on that one.
Yeah, being in the valley, I said it a million times already, but cool climate is our that's our backbone. But it is getting hotter, and so it is getting warmer. So those are some of the things that we need to keep in consideration. Climate change, it varies. We saw, in 2020, the whole state was kind of burning down. we had to deal with fires and smoke, something we never had to deal with before. And then we also had to deal with different heat spikes. We had 3 significant heat spikes in one harvest, and being in the valley, to where we kind of hang our hat on these long growing seasons, but then suddenly you get these big major heat spikes, just weeks, before you're expected to pick, and all of a sudden you got to pick a week earlier just because you just lost a lot of weight through dehydration. Your sugars went through the roof. But those are the things that we adapt to as winemakers. Climate change is definitely Mother Nature is kind of taking charge there, and so we've learned to adapt. We've learned to understand that something during the harvest, there's going to be some major event during the harvest that's going to have to force us to maybe change course. And so that is not unusual. In fact, when we don't have to change course, that's when it's kind of unusual. Last year was a good example. Everything went really well as far as weather is concerned. The only thing that not the only thing, but one of the major things is that we're still experiencing severe drought in California. But we've learned to adapt with that as well too, though. But climate change is something that we have learned to accept. We've learned to kind of deal with those issues and kind of take it on the head a few times. But it is what it is, and really that's kind of part of harvest. That's part of our job, is learning how to adapt and being able to have enough patience and have a good sense of humor really about it, just knowing that you're going to need to swing, go pull up 180 somewhere. It's just the way it is.
So, yeah, sort of along those lines, Sharon, you've mentioned that you have to worry a bit more about the West Coast than you used to. considering that East Coast viticulture certainly historically was perhaps a bit more variable. But how do you, what are you seeing now? And was this in any way part of your thought process for looking a bit more to Washington State?
Yeah, actually, it was, because one of the biggest concerns for us last year and the year before is the droughts. We have facilities where we take our fruit, we'll process the fruit, and we had one of the facilities that we worked with that we are no longer working with because they don't have enough water for harvest. So, that's really hard to kind of take in, right? That you have to move your facility to other locations because you don't have enough water. So last year, what I found, similar to what the 2 gentlemen mentioned, was lower yields during harvest, but not because of low fruit set. It was because of berry weight. And I'm like, we looked at these things in June. They were fine. The grapes were fine in June. Where did the weight go? And they were just dehydrated grapes in certain situations, not everywhere in the state, but certain areas of the state. So monitoring the water is really important for the grower, and knowing when to turn water on if there's water available. That's the biggest thing. There's not always water available to irrigate during harvest. Now on the East Coast, problem's a little bit different because we might have too much water during harvest time. So a drought for us in North Carolina, which is not the same type of drought on the West Coast, is a good thing for us during harvest time. That's when we typically have our best fruit and the best quality. One of the things that I have seen is that harvest is happening earlier. I usually try to get a quick Labor Day beach trip in maybe, and I've not been able to do that the past few years. So because grapes are coming in August, and they might normally come in September. So just kind of paying attention to that and being aware that you might have to check fruit earlier than you did in years past. But as Rob and Kit both mentioned, being a winemaker, you have to be able to adapt and be flexible and scheduling, and you may have this idea about what the fruit is going to be, but if it's not looking to make a unbelievable Cabernet, maybe you make a rosé, or you just kind of adapt and go with the grape. So I always try to look at the grape, on the crush stalk, and make sure that I'm not making a mistake of the path of the grape. And I don't want to pretend like the fruit's going to be something it can't be. So as long as you're honest with yourself about your ability and your winemaking skill set, and you should be able to make a really good quality wine, but it might not always be what you set out to do, or the path you thought the grape would be on in May or June. So harvest can always be a challenge.
And of course, Kip, I think earlier on you mentioned a couple specific incidences like frost in May in Paso, which eliminated a source or two for you. But then conversely, you're already seeing a couple 100-degree days in the area. So not without the stressors as well.
Yeah, I think we've had between June and already through halfway through July, I think we've had probably 8 to 10 triple degree days. We had one yesterday. It was 101 in Paso, which is, unseasonable. And what that's doing, like Sharon mentioned, like it's just moving harvest forward. We're about 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule right now. We've already got a couple spots that are starting to color up, which is pretty early. Much like I mentioned about the dry farm fruit getting hit by heat, a lot of the times, as Rob made a great point of mentioning, like it's now those outlier events are becoming normal. So if we don't have one, it's kind of a surprise, whether that's heat or fire or frost or some other extreme weather event. There's always something, and a lot of the times it can put you in a position, and I can't imagine how Sharon manages it without like crazy good partners, of hitting picking points where you're not necessarily picking in the optimal condition, you're picking at the point of diminishing returns, where, okay, it's not going to get better. Or if you're looking at the weather, and Rob and I always talk about those things that wake you up at 3 a.m, especially during harvest, and it's usually a heat spike or something coming in front of you that you may not be able to pivot quick enough on in terms of picking, but where, say, if you do have ample enough warning, say if you're picking Cabernet Sauvignon and you see a heat spike coming and you're not quite there, but you know that if you try to ride the heat spike, the fruit won't be, you're going to just nuke the fruit. So you're picking not in an ideal scenario, you're just trying to pick around this major weather event or the outlier event. So it can really, and like Sharon mentioned, it really puts your skills as a winemaker to a test. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it pans out in the way you want it to, and other times I call it getting the wrenches out on a winemaking front, where you're getting the wrenches out to try and work on the wine, and because that does happen, and that's, like Rob mentioned, that's becoming the norm, where you really have to be able to pivot quickly and understand that your storybook vintage is probably not going to go the way you wanted it to. So that's those climate events are now our normal part of our normal operating procedure now.
Well, given all of those aspects that you have to keep in mind, I want to, for our sort of final question here, bring it back around to the consumer preferences, and how those also play a role in some of your decision making. For example, Sharon, you had mentioned that some of the aromatic whites really resonate with some of your audience, and so how you've been able to source a couple new varieties to fill out your portfolio on that front.
Yeah, we've been making aromatic wines and sweet wines in North Carolina pretty much since the start of the winery. So I'm in the Southeast, the taste is a little bit more sweet. Sweet tea is, part of what we do in the South. And so, people might be used to something a little bit sweeter. So we have to offer our guests wines along that line. More recently, we've really started to do more of the muscats. We do an orange muscat varietal, which is kind of fun, a Gewürztraminer, an aromatic blend. We do a Christmas wine that's very fun and aromatic for our guests. And, it really resonates with the people that visit Biltmore. We've been doing a limited release Chenin Blanc that's sweet since I've been at Biltmore. And that's one of a favorite for a lot of our guests. And, the challenge in the past has been trying to find these aromatic varietals, but it seems like they're becoming more available since everyone's familiar with like the sparkling Moscatos. And we do a sparkling Moscato called Pas de Deux. And so it's just this really traditional method sparkling wine made out of Moscato, made out of Muscat Canelli. So it's kind of fun for our guests as well. A lot of the people that visit Biltmore may have never even visited a winery before. And so we might be that first taste of wine that they get. And obviously the first taste of wine for somebody, it's usually not a really bold Napa Cab. You usually have to start with something a little bit more sweeter or off dry, like our Pinot Grigio. So we have over 45 different wines for people to try, but we have many aromatic whites for them as well.
And Kip, of course, you're talking about creating these different blends that hit on different things that entice the consumer. And how have you taken their preferences into account?
So with Chronic, the best description that was ever given to me by someone tasting our wines, like, oh, these aren't very shy. So they're typically pretty big and bold and really punchy. So when I'm checking out new vineyards, now I'm looking under that lens. We have a couple of our reserve SKUs that are a little lighter bodied, or more like, or Mourvedre based, or a little more high tone Zin, where they're a little racy, not quite as big bodied. So, with those programs in mind, I'm looking at areas that have a cooler microclimate, maybe have a little more of an alluvial soil type. But for programs like one of our broad market programs is called Sweet Petite, which is a varietal Petite Syrah. So Petite Syrah does typically very, very well in warmer areas. So for that program specifically, I found a vineyard that is, politely say, out in the hula gulies, where it's on the eastern side of Paso Robles, where it gets very, very hot and holds the heat for a lot longer. So the colors, the tannin structure is crazy strong. The color is really deep. It's very bold, very big bodied. So it's, picking these areas that really that fit into one bucket or another for Chronic. And we have within that, to bring it back to what I was saying initially, to bring it back under that umbrella principle of, kind of more forward wines. We have little nuances within that within that umbrella. So I'll pick for certain spots like that really help bring out those characteristics.
And Rob, of course, we've had a lot of, I'm sure you have a lot of Bayliana consumers who've been with the brand for a very long time. And so how do you keep them in mind while battling all of these sort of climatic and other things that are going on, which may be adding some pressure?
Yeah, well, our Bayliana consumers have been around for a while. I just did a vineyard tour with some of the original club members this last weekend, and like Sharon, you mentioned all the different SKUs you have. I bottled, I think, 38 different SKUs this year, and everything is just a little bit different. But a big part of those SKUs are the D2C wines, and each one of those D2C wines is really been kind of crafted for those who are visiting the tasting rooms and our club members, and they appreciate the different changes and the different things that we're doing to the wines, and all in the vein of obviously just trying to make a better wine every year. Our broad market wines, we have a Tangent label, which is all aromatic whites, stainless steel ferments. It took us a real long time to really kind of craft our Sauvignon Blanc the way it is. And so we've gone through a bunch of different trials, but it's really hard to really try to appease to one type of consumer with that wine. And so what we try to do was just try to involve all the different consumers into one bottle. And, we're still working on it, but it's, it was a task that was put onto us by marketing and the owners to try to find that one bottle of wine that's going to really try to appease to all the different consumers. And I'm specifically talking about Sauvignon Blanc, for example. But when you go back to the D2C wines, tasting wines, the wines I made for the wine club, that gives us a really good opportunity to really stretch out and try to make, we have 5 different Pinot Noirs, and they all fall in the same vein, but they're all just a little bit different. And so the idea is to maybe tap into that one visitor to the tasting room, and maybe they can find of those 5 Pinot Noirs something they really enjoy. And that's always been really fun for me. I mean, as a winemaker, that is kind of where we get kind of creative and just kind of say, hey, let's try this, let's, see if this works, see what sticks, what doesn't stick. Those are the kind of things that makes it really exciting. So we do appreciate everyone that comes into the tasting room and tastes all those different wines, because they're all going to be fairly different. And of those 38 SKUs, they should find something that they enjoy. But there's a bit, it's pretty broad. You can go everything from aromatic whites all the way up to our True Myth brands, which is these Paso big cab.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today. This has been a really interesting discussion, and not to try and distill it too far down, but I think there's 3 sort of key takeaways that I get from this, and I can sum them up in like 3 words. And the first I would say is creativity, or perhaps it's adaptability, but it's, both in the winemaking and in problem solving, that seems certainly to be a key feature of some of the things you've talked about today. 2 would be stories, and how the former lends itself to the finished wine and the story it has to tell. And finally, relationships, which is the bedrock of what makes everything go round. So thank you for sharing all of your insight on that front. And thank you all for joining us today. This is going to wrap it up as we've reached our hour mark. But again, thanks to Sharon Fenchak of Biltmore Winery, Kip Lorenzetti of Chronic Cellars, and Rob Takagawa of Beliana Winery for lending us your insight today.